This is the £100 million bat shed. What you're looking at is a concept drawing of a shelter which has been proposed to keep a colony of bats safe from a new railway development here in the UK known as HS2. Now, ever since this story came out, I have been trying to wrap my head around this. I've been trying to understand why this costs 100 million. I've been trying to think about what else they could have done. And really, I've come to the conclusion that this reveals the truth around planning and development here in the UK and how we're mitigating losses to our natural world. So I just want to share my thoughts on this. My name's Rob, this is Leave Curious. We cover stories of nature restoration. Sometimes I'm off out showing you a project, we're exploring a beautiful habitat, and sometimes I'm sat here in my office just trying to understand these kinds of stories. So without giving hours and hours of context around what HS2 is and what it represents, HS2 is a high-speed railway development which is in construction. It's making its way up from London up to Birmingham, and it has been controversial to say the least. It has been widely criticised for overspending, but even deeper and darker than this, it is being called a scandal, a black hole for taxpayers' money. Now, for clarity and focus, let's just look at what's going on specifically with this bat shed. So there's a section of the line which is passing by an ancient woodland in Buckinghamshire. Now, this ancient woodland is known as Sheep House Wood. Within this woodland is a colony of a very rare bat species here in the UK known as Bechstein's bat. Now, the Bechstein's bat is a really beautiful, interesting bat. I mean, I think all bats are just like incredible, kind of freakish looking. But this bat is an ancient woodland specialist. It almost exclusively lives in and roosts and forages and works within ancient woodlands. So really, if you understand how the UK has lost many of its ancient woodlands and how the ones which we still have are being stressed, it's really, no prizes for understanding why this species has declined so much here in Britain. So in order to best understand this story, I need to introduce the two core characters, because there's been some quite interesting back and forth here. So one of them is HS2. These are the guys who are building and constructing and moving this railway project forward. And then the other is Natural England. These are a government body who are there to ensure that these kinds of developments are sustainable and they have nature and they're not just obliterating ancient woodlands in order to get it done. So these guys have said from the start that HS2 has to ensure that the bats in this woodland are protected during the development and after it's built. This isn't new knowledge. This is quite crucial to understand. HS2 has known about the need to mitigate the Bechstein's bat here for the past 10 years. So HS2 has had a very long time in order to come up with a solution to this. And what they've come up with is the £100 million bat shed. But before we get into exactly what this bat shed is and what it does, there's been quite this back and forth which has come out. So the story came out, HS2 has said, this is what we're building, it costs 100 million. Everyone, mainstream media has jumped on this and everyone has been asking what the hell, why does this cost 100 million? Natural England have seen this and they've kind of distanced themselves from this story somewhat. They've basically said that, look, we're here to advise HS2, but we have never told them that they have to spend 100 million. We've never exactly told them what to do. Natural England have said that it's up to HS2 to come up with the ideas, cost it, plan it, and then they present it to Natural England, and Natural England can just say whether if this is a viable solution in order to protect the bats. And it turns out that the £100 million bat shed will work. And now another interesting tidbit to all of this is the chairman of HS2, what's his name? Sir John Thompson. Sir John Thompson. He's I saw an interview with him recently, and he's been, he was speaking broadly about how HS2 has been criticised for overspending, and he's kind of said it's kind of obvious why we have had to overspend. It's because all the way along the whole route, we've had to come up against, I think it's over 8,000 different hurdles. So this is where they have to get compliance and consent from 8,000 different organizations. And the bat shed is the example which he gave of this. And he's kind of said, look, you know, he was being very flippant about it. He was being very, you know, it was like this, you know, I used to work in the development world. I was an ecological consultant, and very often when you would go to a development site, you would just feel like a thorn in the side of that development. And very often it was bats, you know, you'd have like a colony of bats living up in the top of the building, and, you know, you just couldn't help but feel as an ecologist that you were a thorn in the developer's side. And the way that Sir John Thompson was talking about this, he was just basically just being like, yeah, look, it's no wonder why, because we have to, you know, build this £100 million bat shed in order to protect just a few bats. He was kind of like downplaying the importance of protecting our ecology. And I think that's a little bit interesting, because if you think about this, HS2 have clearly spent a long time coming to this conclusion, coming to this idea, and for their like main dude to just be like, oh yeah, God, what a pain in the arse, it just doesn't really add up. So that's kind of the drama. That's kind of what's been said about this. I'm sure there's a lot more to say about that still. But what I want to do now is I want to get into thinking about, why does this mitigation cost 100 million? I want to think about what else they could have done. And I then want to sort of talk about my thoughts on this and what this says about the whole sort of bigger picture of development planning and the mitigation for our natural world. 100 million is an awful lot of money. I actually have a friend who kind of works in this world, and I've been speaking with them. Unfortunately, they couldn't come on the channel. But one thing which came out of our conversation is that this is a pretty long way. This is a 1 kilometer stretch of the line in which they have to build this structure. Now, this structure is effectively a concrete tunnel which is going over the line. I think what HS2 have come up with, you know, when rationalizing this, they've just said, look, we need to ensure that bats aren't going to be pummeled by our high-speed trains. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a concrete shelter over the whole thing. So from a bat's perspective, these railway lines, I think it's like 4 lines in a row. I think it's got bigger and bigger. That's another factor to this as well. I think the original costings for this mitigation was something like 30 million, but because they've had to extend and widen the railway, the costs, the raw materials of building this concrete tunnel have only gone up. And I think another element to why this has cost so much is the legal fees in getting this thing over the line. So while Natural England have approved it and said, yeah, this is great, this is going to work for the bats, HS2 have then had to take this to local planning authorities in order to get this through. And, you know, I think it was Buckinghamshire, they've said, no, there's no way you're going to build this. It is an eyesore. It's going to be a blot on the landscape. So in order to overcome that, HS2 have had to spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds in legal fees in order to get this thing over the line. So that's where some of the money has gone. What's so special about this bat tunnel? You know, is there anything inherently about it? Is there some kind of technology? Is there something special about it in which the bats are going to be able to like move freely over this? And I've been looking into this, and I don't think there's anything inherently special about this or inherently expensive about this, which is going to ensure that the bats are going to be okay. There are going to be some crossing points over the tunnel, which effectively I think the idea is to ensure that the bats aren't going to be crossing at a high risk point. So the crossing points which they are putting in place are going to be at like the most minimal risk places. But in doing that, I don't think there's any great expenditure. I think that the great expenditure on this is in the sheer construction, is in the sheer scale of this thing. But that's not to say, you know, I haven't got the full picture on what's been going on. Look, HS2 has been widely criticised as a black hole for taxpayers' money. Is there something more sinister going on here? Share your thoughts on this down in the comments. I'm really interested to know. Now, when it comes to thinking about what else they could have done, then this £100 million bat shed is, well, really there's 2 clear things in my mind. One is to reroute the line away from the ancient woodland, and then the other is to dig a tunnel, go under the ground, bypass this. clearly, these two options would have cost more than building this £100 million bat shed. I think one of the things to understand with HS2 is that the route has had to, because it's a high-speed train, the line has to be pretty straight. So, you know, in order to divert it and bend it and go around things, it's just not possible. And that's another reason why they've had to spend so much money already acquiring land to make this thing straight, and they've had to build these bridges which go over rivers, just in order to keep this thing straight so it can move at a high speed. And one maybe slightly less sure way to ensure that the bats don't come to harm is to perhaps just, you know, build single or a few crossing points over the tracks, and encourage the bats into that way. So perhaps you clear the woodland where you don't want the bats to go and you sort of channel them over, but I don't think that would ever have passed with Natural England. So they really had to do something big, and it just seems like out of all these big options, building this bat shed was the cheapest one. And another thing to note about this, and whether this really justifies spending £100 million on this, is that this 100 million makes up a tiny fraction of the entire budget, of the entire expected cost, which I think are now at 70 billion. Yeah, somewhere between 72 billion and 98 billion pounds. So 100 million is just like a drop in the ocean. So now I just want to share my thoughts on this and really what I think the bigger picture is here. So traditionally in the UK, when it comes to nature restoration, you have conservation. This was the mindset that in the landscape we have these notable areas, these precious areas, whether it's habitats or species, and we need to keep them safe. We need to wrap them in bubble wrap and make sure that they're not being affected by the outside world. While this has ensured that we have these like really precious and beautiful pockets, we're learning that it is just making them more stressed and less resilient. Whereas now the thinking is this new form of nature restoration, which is rewilding. It's about looking at these precious areas. It's about looking at the areas around them. It's about looking at degraded areas and thinking about how can we restore nature at a landscape scale and really making it self-regulating. This whole bat shed thing, £100 million being spent on this, feels a lot like a conservation measure. Now, if it costs £100 million to keep these bats safe, then spend it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but what I am saying is why is £100 million readily available at the drop of a hat to be spent on this when, you know, there's a need for these vast, large-scale projects across the country? Why isn't there £100 million being spent on a really meaningful, large-scale nature restoration project, which, you know, in a few hundred years could be a place where you could have thousands of Bechstein's bats living? It just seems like there's a real imbalance in the priorities here, and, you know, it seems like we're only bothered about nature restoration because it's the law, and that, you know, these bats have to be protected, so let's just spend loads of money on it. Let's just like make sure this problem goes away. Really, I think it's a case of priorities. Yes, the UK needs better transport links, but the UK also needs to ensure that biodiversity is returning. You know, the health of our landscapes, whether if it's in nature reserves, whether if it's in agriculture, whether if it's in energy, the health of our landscape is kind of imperative to all of those things. So I would just like to see a bit more money being readily put into that. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this. I mean, the whole thing is a bit of a mess. I've given myself a bit of a headache yapping on about this for so long now. I'm really interested to know your thoughts on this. Let me know down in the comments. If you're interested in learning more about nature restoration, then please do subscribe to Leave Curious. The best way you can support the channel is by becoming a member over on Patreon. I'll leave a link to this down in the comments. If you want to keep watching the channel, check out the video that's on the screen now. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. Leave Curious.